Mike Shayne Mystery Magazine, Crime and Good Girl Art, and these are from the 1960s issues, sampling. Um, Mike Shayne started in September of 1956. That was the first issue, and it ran until August of 1985. About 300 issues in 29 years. So it's like quite an unbelievable run that they had. The Digest magazine. It was hard-boiled crime and all kinds of stuff in between. It was really a fine magazine. It had its ups and downs. It had its good times and bad because over the 29 years you had some great authors writing for it and great cover art. You had Rudy Nappy, Robert Maguire, and a lot of other fine cover artists who did covers for them. The 1960s issues somehow seemed to be scarce or just uncommon, and somehow 1965 and 1966 seemed to be a little more harder to find. We're going to take a look at some of them now. Two issues. The thing is also that what I want to say is that on the Mike Shayne, especially, there was is interesting because they reused a lot of the cover art from earlier issues. So you'll see art that was on an issue in the 60s or 70s. It would be back used in the 80s, maybe cropped, or a piece of it was reduced or something. You also saw cover art that was that appeared on the Man from U.N.C.L.E. and the Woman from U.N.C.L.E. Digest magazines. So these were all like kind of intermingled. Leo Margulies was the editor. Renowned Publications was the publisher. But behind the scenes was Ed Balcourt, who was an artist and who I've interviewed and who I've had as a guest at my book shows. He passed away a few years ago, but Ed was one of the first agents of artists, and he had a lot of artists who that worked for him, and he agented their art to different publishers, and especially to Leo Margulies at Mike Shayne Mystery Magazine. In fact, there's one time when I was talking with Barry Balcourt, Ed's son. They were talking about how he remembered them putting together the covers for Mike Shayne's Mystery Magazine at their home in the kitchen table, kind of just putting them together, doing the paste ups and the way they used to do it in the old days. So it's Mike Shayne's a cool magazine. The other thing that's interesting about it is it had a lead novelette by Brett Halliday, who wrote the Mike Shayne stories and novels, and then a lot of other, maybe like 5 or 6 short stories by other writers, and some of the writers are quite good. Some of them would go on to become household names, or at least well-known and collected authors. Others are kind of forgotten. We'll take a look at them now. Also, later on in the 80s, you had other writers who were writing under Brett Halliday. So like an author like James Reesner was writing Brett Halliday, Mike Shayne lead novelettes for some of the issues in the 1980s. So without further ado, we're going to take a look at some of the Mike Shaynes now. Here's one where I believe it's pretty sure that Rudy Nappy did the cover, and there's two covers. This is the issue from October of 1963, and then they reused the cover art on the May 1971 issue. And the issue had they usually didn't credit the artists. Inside you had a Robert Bloch story, a Mike Avallone story, Dennis Lynn's story on the 1963 issue. On the 1971 issue, there was work by Hugh Walpole and Larry Killian and Edwin P. Hicks. So that's why they would reuse the cover art on some of the issues. The August 1963 issue has an Earl Stanley Gardner story, Take It or Leave It, from 1939. It's a reprint. It has Dennis Lynn's, Talmadge Powell, James Holding. Usually the backup stories, you can see here. So they would start off with a lead-off novel. In this case, it's a Earl Stanley Gardner story. And this was a reprint from 1939. Then there would be a new Mike Shayne story. And then there would be short stories, usually 4, 5, or 6 stories. And these stories were usually originals by current authors of the time. And this is how a lot of authors were able to break into fiction. So this is the August 1963 issue. And the cover art, not sure who did the cover art. I mean, that's definitely appears to be a Maguire girl. So it looks like a Robert Maguire cover, but it's not signed. But I would, if I had to make a guess, I would say it was Robert Maguire. They also, June 1966 issue, Dan Ross, Steve April. This is Brett Halliday with a picture of Brett Halliday with his eye patch. Talk about toughest private eye writer in the business. And you can see the June 66 issue, the Brett Halliday lead-off novelet, and stories by various writers. Steve April was a pseudonym. I don't recall who it was for, but it was definitely was a pseudonym. And this is the cover. At certain times, they would have these line drawings, which didn't really do it for me, but they did use all kinds of art on the covers and reused art, and it was a kind of a mix mash of different cover images that they had on these issues. I mean, it was a 29-year period, so they had a lot of 300 issues, a lot of cover art that they used and then they reused. The January 66 issue as Thomas Calvert McClary, who was a science fiction writer, Jack Ritchie, Hal Elson, who was the J.D. writer who lived in Brooklyn, Edward Wellen, who was also a crime writer who actually had as a guest at my book show a few years ago. And again, this is the January 66 issue. And here they're doing a mix of art that was maybe taken from somewhere else and a face that line drawing, kind of mixing them together. This might be the kind of thing that Ed Balcourt would maybe manufacture for a cover. The June 68 issue has Robert Hart Davis, who did a lot of the lead-off novels during the years of Mike Shayne, and then they had a new Brett Halliday story. There was also a Robert Colby story, Ed Lacey story, Morris Hirschman, and Clayton Matthews. Morris Hirschman was a friend of mine and was a guest at my show many years. And there's the cover for that issue. They ran some true crime in the magazines, different issues, and Mike Avalone did some articles on pulp magazines. The May 1960 issue has Talmadge Powell, Manly Wade Wellman, Richard Deming, Peter Chaney, John Creasy. Sir Leone did the cover art. This is one of the only times he seemed to be one of the only people that was given cover credit. Sir Leone was he did quite a few covers for Mike Shayne and also for Cozy Books, and you'll see in the Cozy Book episode on these videos some of his covers for Sleaze. But he also did Mike Shayne covers. It's been since told to me that Sir Leone was actually Sergio Leone. He was a a cover artist, and not to be confused with Sergio Leone, the Italian spaghetti western film director. And then there was also other Leones. There was John Leone, who was a very well-respected editor at Bantam Books, and there was
Wasn't John Leone also an artist?
John Leone was actually I got confused. John Leone was the artist who was a friend of Robert Maguire, who did a lot of Western covers, and Len Leone was the editor at Bantam Books at this time. So there were a lot of Leones that were doing work, art and editorial work, and in the 1960s. And so this is the May 1960 issue, and it's a Sir Leone cover art. It's credited to him. The July 1964 issue has the short espionage novel Betrayed by John D. MacDonald. It's a 40-page novelette. Also stories by Dennis Lins and Ed Lacey and others. That's the cover there. And I just wanted to show on the inside here is also another picture with information on Brett Halliday. He was very much involved in the magazine, and Leo Margulies was the publisher, editor. The April '64 issue was had work by Edward Wellen, and a Murder Takes a World Cruise was a lead novel by Charles Ventura. Don't know who that is. Cover art's not credited. Just seeing these different covers from the 60s kind of brings back a lot of memories. They're kind of cool. This was a great magazine in its day. The November 1964 issue has a Arsène Lupin story, which is a classic reprint by Maurice LeBlanc. Also stories by Morris Hirschman, Dennis Lins, and Carol Myers, and James Holding. James Holding was an Australian author who wrote a lot of pulp science fiction in Australia, and they must have reprinted it here. The cover art, I don't know who did the cover art on this one, but it's been used on others. I recognize this image from other, either Mike Shayne magazines or other magazines. Again, like I say, they used and reused different images. They would crop them. They would sometimes make them smaller or larger. The August 1964 issue had a reprint by W.R. Burnett, Vanishing Act. Had a bright segment, story by Theodore Sturgeon, and it had stories by Don von Eisner and Will Ausler. Pretty good issue with Sturgeon and Burnett in it. And of course you always had the Brett Halliday novel. This is August 1964. And all the issues, so you had the, open up and you have your contents page with all the information. You have your lead-off novel or novelette by Brett Halliday with some line drawing and pretty much the same zigzag story. You have pretty much the same format, same kind of style and design in each issue, just to give you an idea what the insides look like. Don von Eisner story. W.R. Burnett, Vanishing Act. The March 1963 issue had Richard Deming, Dennis Lins, and Robert Calvert McClary. It had a short novel Death Rides the Skeeto by Q. Patrick. That was a reprint from 1941. And I don't know who did the cover art on this. A lot of them, the cover art isn't signed and there's no credit given. The March 1964 issue has stories by William Vance, Dan Ross, Arnold English, who was a pseudonym of Morris Hirschman, and here's the cover for that. The September 1964 issue, the featured novel is Troubleshooter by Richard Prather. That's almost certainly has to be a reprint. Yes, the 1956. It's a reprint. Raymond F. Banks, Jack Ritchie, The Gun Next Door by Mike Avallone, The Joker by Morris Hirschman, and Homecoming by Dennis Linz. Dennis Linz, Morris Hirschman, Mike Avallone, Jack Ritchie were all kind of the stable of writers, some of the stable that made up the stable of writers for Mike Shayne Mystery Magazine. Another cover. Don't know. Fortunately, there's some writing on there, but I don't know who did the cover on that one. The December 1965 issue. Just going through all these issues and seeing the covers is kind of cool, and hope you enjoy looking at them as much as I enjoy showing them to you. It's a nice group of books, of magazines. The December 65 issue has Larry Maddock, who wrote a lot of science fiction, and then Dennis Linz, Christopher Anvil, another science fiction writer. It has Act of God by Wyatt Blassingame, a pulp writer from the old days who was also an agent, and it has The Dull Snap by Ed Lacey. Here's the Accent on Murder by Brett Halliday, the opening novelet, and they use a little color in there. And the rest of the issue. Little spot black and white illustrations. Kind of cool. Whoops. Tom Curry. The August 65 issue has Jonathan Craig, Fletcher Flora, John Jakes, The Letter by Donald E. Westlake, The Old Pro by Avram Davidson. Some good writers in all of these issues. And that's the August 65 issue with a nice, somebody wrote again 15 on the cover. Don't know why people did that. The May 64 issue has Silent Witness by Dorothy Patterson Galt, and I'm wondering if that's a pseudonym for William Campbell Galt. Not sure. It also has Dennis Linz, Hal Elson, Bryce Walton, Will Ausler, who was a really good hard-boiled writer, very underrated. Talmadge Powell, Innocent Victim by Will F. Jenkins, who was the real name of Murray Leinster, the science fiction writer, and The Paper Signal by Arnold English, who was Morris Hirschman. Some good writers in there. And that's the May 64 issue. It's a little crinkled. Sometimes you can't, when you're collecting these and you're looking for them, some of these issues are hard to find, and you kind of take what you can get until you can upgrade them. The January 1964 issue has two Mike Shayne stories, a novelette and a serial by Brett Halliday. Has a story by Dennis Linz. It has a story Still Life by Frank Belknap Long, the horror science fiction writer who was one of the writers in the Lovecraft Circle. And A Frame Has Four Sides by Mike Avallone. And that's the January 64 cover. And the February 1965 You have An Enemy at the Dinner Table, the featured short novel by Van Wyck Mason, who was more of a historical novelist. You have The Ring of Truth by Henry Slessor, who was a terrific crime and mystery writer. Neighborhood Killer by Frank Belknap Long, and Edwin P. Hicks, and others. And that's the February '65 issue. And so those are the some of the Mike Shayne mystery magazines from the 1960s. There's one other that I want to show you, is the September 1973 issue. And this issue has stories by Gary Bradner, probably one of his early stories, James McKimmey, who's a really good hard-boiled writer, Dan Ross, Irwin Porges, Clark Howard, David Marzoff does a novelette, offers a novelette, and the interesting thing about this September '73 issue is the cover art. Don't know who did it, maybe Doug Weaver, I'm not sure, but is definitely, this cover art was reused from the Girl from Uncle magazine, or would be later used on the Girl from Uncle magazine. So that was another one that was used. I think it's just cool to take a look at some of these '60s Mike Shayne magazines. The cover art isn't great on some of them. But it's interesting. They're magazines that kind of don't show up, and they have a really lot of good writers that got their start in these issues. The backup short stories, usually 5 or 6 of them in an issue, are terrific. Some of the classic reprints are great. And then you had people like William Hart Davis writing feature stories for each issue. And in the 80s, you had people like James Reeser, great writers, who did Mike Shayne stories as Brett Halliday. So there's a lot in these issues, and there's 300 issues. Again, it's published from 1956 to 1985, an amazing run. And the other thing is I have a original, this is pretty cool, an original Mike Shayne cover painting by Earl Morey. And just to kind of top off this video, cover art for Mike Shayne's is around. Sometimes you see it popping up from here to there. Sometimes trying to find what issue the art goes to can be difficult. If anybody does know which issue this art was used on, I'd really appreciate letting me know, because that's one that I don't have, but one that I definitely want to get. So, hope you enjoyed this look at a 1960s Mike Shayne. I think that's a cool magazine, and it's we're going to look at more digest crime magazines and more digests in future episodes. But I just wanted to give you a gander at these, and maybe if you like it, we'll take a look at some from the 50s and from the 70s and 80s. So I hope you enjoyed it. Give us a thumbs up if you liked the video, and a like, and subscribe, and thanks for looking.